Greetings and welcome back to our continued discussion here of The Merchant of Venice. We are in Act 2, and during this video, we're going to be speaking about scenes 6 through 9. Just kind of a reminder on what I had set up for Act 2, some ideas, and the idea that in Act 2, we see a whole bunch of folks who lose something, and one folk, Lancelot, who gains something, and that's servitude to Bassanio. So, quotation fingers wins. He wins the opportunity to be a servant. I don't know how much of a win that is, but so that's what we've been discussing and looking at in this act. When we were last together, we took a look at scenes 1 through 5, and when we finished off with Act 2, Scene 5, we saw Jessica closing the scene out with a heroic couplet, saying that she is going to be leaving her father, the Jew, to become the Christian wife of Lorenzo. And so let's dive in here and take a look and pick up here in scene 6. So we're going to be taking a look at Act 3, Scene 6. Location is outside of Shylock's house, and not a lot of time has gone by since Act 5 has ended. We don't know specifically how much time, but we know it isn't a significant amount of time. So we are outside of Shylock's house, and who's on the scene? Well, we have Gratiano and Salerio, in some texts, Celerino. And eventually Lorenzo will be showing up here, and they have arrived to take Jessica away. Gratiano and Salerio are first, and they joke a little bit about how, isn't it interesting that the only guy who's not here yet is the guy who's in love and is supposed to be stealing Jessica away? And so they joke around a little bit about that. But Lorenzo eventually shows up here at the beginning of the scene, and we find that Jessica is ready at her window. Now, if you recall, when she was left by Shylock, she was told to lock up the house and don't keep the doors locked and keep the windows closed. I don't want you to be staring out at these Christian fools, essentially, who are going to be having a masquerade, masks out in the streets. And there she is as we meet her in a window, and we presume a higher story, a second story, perhaps window is generally how it's acted out. And I think that's the intent of Shakespeare's part here, that there is some distance between Lorenzo, Gratiano, Salerio on the ground and Jessica up in the window. And when we see her here, she is now dressed as a boy. And this is the first of 3 times in this play that we will see a female character dress up as a male. So this is the first time. Now, this is, of course, a staple of the Shakespearean comedy, and I discussed this in my video lecture about the Shakespearean comedy. And what is that all about? Well, as discussed in the video, in the Shakespearean comedy is typically the women who solve the problems in the plays, but they do so under the guise of men. They are dressed as men to get things fixed. Why is that? Well, back to the old idea and the a belief that it is the male who dominates and only the male can be taken seriously. So certainly, if anybody's going to fix anything that's gone wrong someplace, it's going to have to be a man. So if a woman's going to fix anything, she's going to have to do it dressed as a male. In this particular case, Jessica has dressed up as a male as a disguise. She's dressed up as a male Christian, even as a disguise. She will be the servant of Lorenzo, because women wouldn't be expected to be out at night in these masks, these mask parties. Well, actually, some women would be, but it would be a very specific type that would be out at night. But it would generally be the boys that would be out celebrating. So she has to dress up as a boy so as to be least suspected of anything. Because she wants to be able to escape not just Shylock's house here, but the ghetto where the Jews are, undetected. And she's ashamed. And she says these very things. She is ashamed for a couple of reasons. One, that Lorenzo, her love, is going to see her dressed as a boy, and that causes her shame. She's embarrassed that he would see her in such a way. But perhaps also she, and maybe more of the undertones, she may also be indicating to some degree, even if it's subconsciously, that there may be some shame for her in dressing as a Christian. The degree to which Jessica embraces this new faith of Christianity can certainly be called into question in this play. Because it really at no point does Jessica suggest that she has adopted this faith because she's had some sort of religious conversion, which begs the question whether or not she really ever does, or if she does this out of convenience. And if that's the case, then you certainly could understand how, at least subconsciously, she might be ashamed of the way that she is dressed. What she does here, and this is neatly depicted in this image, and this is a pretty common scene from Shakespeare image, and that is the image of Jessica throwing a casket of Shylock's jewels and monies out the window to Lorenzo, who waits to catch the casket, and you can kind of see off to the side there, wearing the masks, of course, presumably Gratiano and Salerio. While he stands underneath to catch it. And the line's actually kind of amusing. Jessica says, "Here, catch this casket. It's worth the pains," with the idea that this is a very heavy casket that she's throwing out the window, and that be careful, this thing might hurt, but in the end, it's going to be worth it for both of us that we have this. And then she says, "I'm glad 'tis night. You do not look on me, for I am much ashamed of my exchange. But love is blind, and lovers cannot see the pretty follies that themselves commit. For if they could, Cupid himself would blush to see me transformed to a boy." So Jessica's going to escape from this window, frequently enacted with a rope or a ladder or any way that the director would see fit. At the Globe Theater, there would have been a balcony, a second level, generally where the musicians would sit, and presumably this would have been acted using that level, and somehow, some way, Jessica would have climbed down. Now, the irony, of course, for the Elizabethan audience is this: the characters, of course, playing the female roles in the 1590s were all men. There were no women actors. It's forbidden. And so the irony here, of course, is that you would have had a male actor portraying a woman who's dressed up as a boy. And so there was an awful lot of that the actors could do with this inherent comedy, but a male playing a female playing a male, and that's an idea that Shakespeare plays up to a greater degree in other texts than Merchant of Venice, which again isn't a ha ha funny type of a play, but still that idea would not be lost on the audience. Moving ahead to scene 7, we move from outside of Shylock's house in Venice back over to Belmont. And remember, we're jumping back and forth between locations here. And what we have here in scene 7 is this is the moment that Morocco is going to make his selection at the 3 caskets. And it is here for the first time that the audience learns about the process of selection. And we learn it from Morocco himself. And so this is what we learn from here. Morocco says, "The first of gold, who this inscription bears, who chooseth me shall gain what many men desire. The second, silver, which this promise carries, who chooseth me shall get as much as he deserves. This third, dull lead, with warning all is blunt, who chooseth me must give and hazard all he hath. How shall I know if I do choose the right?" asks Morocco. And of course, Portia explains that, well, there's a picture of me inside the correct one, a counterfeit is what a picture would be called. There's a picture of me inside the right one. And so this is what we know. There are three chests: gold, silver, and lead. Each one has an inscription, and those are the 3 inscriptions. And basically, that's all you get for information, dude. Make your selection. Choose wisely. That's what we know. So Morocco first goes to and looks at the lead casket, and he reads it again. But now he's specifically pondering lead. What says this leaden casket? Who chooseth me must give and hazard all he hath. Must give? For what? For lead? Hazard for lead? This casket threatens. Men that hazard all do it in hope of fair advantages. He ultimately says, I'll then give nor hazard aught for lead. I am not going to risk everything I have for what? For lead? For a casket of lead? And that's his reasoning for not selecting the lead casket. And so he moves on. He looks at the silver casket. What says the silver with her virgin hue? I suspect he looks over at Portia at that moment, referring to her perhaps. Who chooseth me shall get as much as he deserves. As much as he deserves. Pause there, Morocco, and weigh thy value with an even hand. If thou beest rated by thy estimation, thou dost deserve enough. And yet enough may not extend so far as to the lady. And yet to be afeard of my deserving were but a weak disabling of myself. As much as I deserve, why, that's the lady. I do in birth deserve her, and in fortunes, in graces, and in qualities of breeding. But more than these, in love I do deserve. Morocco is taken by the lead and the silver here, and the thought of what the silver means, and it's very tempting for him here, right? Suggesting that he does deserve the lady, and maybe that's what it's suggesting. But he's also suggesting that as much as you deserve, what if I deserve more? What if the lady is more, and as much as I deserve doesn't include the lady? And so ultimately, he will move to this gold chest, which of course he will select. But he does come to it through a process of thought. And let me read to you this longer section on gold. Let's see once more this saying graved in gold. Who chooseth me shall gain what many men desire. Why, that's the lady. All the world desires her. From the four corners of the earth they come to kiss this shrine, this mortal breathing saint. The Hyrcanian deserts and the vasty wilds of wide Arabia are as thoroughfares now for princes to come to view fair Portia. The watery kingdom, whose ambitious head spits in the face of heaven, is no bar to stop the foreign spirits, but they come as over a brook to see fair Portia. One of these three contains her heavenly picture. Is it like that lead contains her? 'Twere damnation to think so base a thought. It were too gross to rib her cerecloth in the obscure grave. Or shall I think in silver she's immured, being 10 times undervalued to tried gold? Oh, sinful thought. Never so rich a gem was set in worse than gold. They have in England a coin that bears the figure of an angel stamped in gold, but that's insculpted upon. But here an angel in a golden bed lies all within. Deliver me the key. Here do I choose and thrive, I as I may. The reference to the coin in England that bears the figure of an angel, of course, is Shakespeare referring to his own Queen Elizabeth, whose face was stamped on the coins. So there's a nice nod to your sovereign, right? Queen Elizabeth, who likely, would have gone and watched this play. You always want to give a nod to the sovereign if you can, and Shakespeare is not loath to do so. And ultimately, he chooses the gold. He is he is wooed by the gold and everything that gold can bring, and who would be surprised that this would be the case with Morocco. But as we learn, all that glitters, all that glistens is not gold, and he did not choose wisely. Portia's picture is not in the gold chest, and Morocco has lost his suit and must turn and depart from that place quickly. And so Morocco goes away, and I imagine that the audience, might breathe a sigh of relief, because the Moroccan, of course, and now race comes in again, the black character who likely would have been played in blackface in 1597, which is obviously not cool today in the 21st century, nor should it have been at any time. But it's not a cool thing to do. We know better. But the audience would breathe a sigh of relief, because, well, at least Portia has escaped this very real possibility that she would have had to have married a Moroccan who is neither Christian nor white, right? So if we want to look at this as one of those um, plot lines where there's a big red X, excuse me, a big red X that has to be avoided, a divergent plot line from the main one, we can look at this and say that's exactly what this is. And in the very last second, of course, disaster is averted, and he chooses the wrong casket and leaves, and thus ends that particular line. Um, so his lines, and just one more piece on this particular scene. Portia's lines, sorry, as Morocco leaves, and here we have more of the no doubt racist comments, certainly from our brains today. Portia says, "A gentle riddance, draw the curtains, go. Let all of his complexion choose me so." Difficult lines, right? One of the reasons that the Merchant of Venice is a challenging play to stage even today, right? Because of lines like this. But again, remember, we're talking about a different value set, and we're talking about the value. Can agree that the value set was out of whack, but the different value set of the Anglican white people sitting in the Elizabethan theater in this day would all likely have also breathed a sigh of relief that Morocco has lost. Right, clear modern day example of racism. Right, received much differently. And consider this too, right? It's not just that Portia is speaking in blank verse; she's rhyming, right? And rhymes are left for the very very special occasions, and so all the more poignant that she says that within a rhyme. And certainly a way we can take a look at this in the 21st century and recognize some difference in values. Scene 8, as we move on, second to last scene in Act 2. Salario again, Salarino. I'll keep saying that just to hammer it home. Depends on the text. And Solanio discuss some things out in the streets of Venice that they had heard about Shylock. Shylock now apparently has learned that his daughter has gone, fled with a Christian, and his money, a good amount of his money, is gone. And Shylock went to the Duke himself to plead a case, and the Duke himself goes with uh, Shylock to search Bassanio's ship, presuming that Lorenzo was on that ship heading out with Bassanio, looking for Jessica and the jewels, but to no avail. They searched the ship, and neither were there. We hear from Salario that Shylock was crying in the streets of Venice. My daughter, oh my ducats, oh my daughter, fled with a Christian. Oh my Christian ducats, justice, the law, my ducats, and my daughter. A sealed bag, 2 sealed bags of ducats, of double ducats, stolen from me by my daughter, and jewels, 2 stones, 2 rich and precious stones, stolen by my daughter. Justice, find the girl. She hath the stones upon her and the ducats. What does Shylock seem more concerned about here? The fact that his daughter is gone, or the fact that his money is gone? Well, he mentions them both a number of times, but it would seem that he mentions ducats more than he mentions daughter. And maybe in this little scene, these little lines from Shylock, we can perhaps understand what is most valued by Shylock. But he has most certainly lost both at this point, enough to cause him a tremendous amount of frustration and anger. We also learn here from Salerio that a Venetian ship that is believed to have been, thought to have been Antonio's, was reported to have been wrecked in the English Channel, the narrow straits between France and England. If this is true, this is of concern because remember, Antonio is waiting for these ships to come in so that he can pay back the bond. They also discuss that prior to Bassanio getting on his ship to leave, Antonio tells Bassanio, don't worry about any of this. Don't you think about me. I want you to think about Portia and Portia only. And Salanio says these lines, referring to Antonio. He says, I think he only loves the world for him. The first he being Antonio, the second being Bassanio. I think he only loves the world for him. Suggesting, of course, that Antonio's greatest love in the world is Bassanio, which is an interesting line. An interesting line. Starts to beg the question, what exactly are Antonio's feelings towards Bassanio? What is it all about? Using some 16th century values, the closest relationship that men had in these days was to other men, right? Women weren't about with the men. Men were always together with men. And the relationships that men formed with other men were the tightest relationships. It goes back to the days of Beowulf and Hrothgar's thanes and right, what's the greatest relationship that those thanes in Hrothgar's world had? Other thanes. That's where they spent their time. And certainly it could be simply that Antonio, has tremendous feelings. His closest relationship is Bassanio. And that would certainly make an awful lot of sense. Right. And if that's the case, though, what has Antonio done? He has now signed a bond to allow Bassanio to go off and to get married, which very much potentially means that should Bassanio win Portia, that Antonio might lose Bassanio, or at least a part of him. And thus the idea that I put forth at the beginning of Act 2, the idea of losers, folks who lose things. And I think that comes quite clear as a theme in Act 2. Scene 6 I'm sorry, it's not scene 6, scene 9, the final scene in Act 2. We move back over to Belmont and we get the second person who is going to be trying his chance at the chests to win fair Portia. And what we have here is the Prince of Aragon. And the Prince of Aragon is very much set up as I think, a comic character in this play, one who's meant to look like a fool. Keep in mind here, the Elizabethan audience would boo here probably. An Elizabethan audience was a very interactive audience. They were not quiet throughout plays. Today, we're very quiet and very proper when we go see a film or go to a play. But that's not the case in the Elizabethan theater. It's very much an interactive thing. It's designed to be that. And Shakespeare clearly sets this guy up to be Spanish from Spain, because of course, Spain is a longtime foe of Britain and certainly of Queen Elizabeth, and so he would be boo, right? He would be an antagonist. He would be seen as a bad guy, right? And so this is the response that the Elizabethan audience would likely give to this character, and Shakespeare takes complete advantage of that. Right. From Aragon, we learn the rest of the rules of this lottery, and these are the remaining pieces that we hadn't been made aware of yet. And we learned this from Aragon himself. If you're going to take this chance at the caskets, you have to, one, never tell anyone the casket you chose. Right. So if you lose, you're out, and you tell no one else what casket you chose. That's actually not probably so hard to do, because let's just presume that you're the person who chooses incorrectly. When you're walking out and there's another guy in there, do you want to give him a hint? Probably not. So that's probably not a hard thing to do. And if anything, you might hint to him the wrong one, right? Um, Two, if you fail, you are never to seek marriage from anyone else. We learned this already from Morocco. We learned part two already. And three, if you fail, you must leave Belmont immediately. No hanging around like Penelope's suitors do in the Odyssey, right? You're out. Take your stuff and go home. And you must agree to these things before you take your chance. Question here: what keeps folks from breaking the rules if they lose? One, the solemn oath before God, right? And this is important, right? The idea that you are swearing before God this oath, and to violate it would mean to break your oath with God, and that would be a sin. And so essentially, you have the power of God, the oath before God, that is what holds these people who fail to the rules. Cleverly set up, certainly by Portia's father, who's thought this thing through, I think, pretty well. Continuing along, Aragon's response when he looks at the three caskets are pretty fascinating, right? Um, when he looks at the lead casket and he reads it and it says, you must give and hazard all you have, he looks over at Portia and he says to her, "You should look fairer ere I give or hazard." I get the little thing there. He said, "What? Wait a minute. You should look fairer ere I give or hazard." Aragon has just suggested that Portia isn't pretty enough for him to choose lead. Now, right, everything we've heard about Portia so far, right, certainly from Bassanio, the fair Portia from Morocco, that she is, tremendously attractive. And yet Aragon says this. Fascinating. And it's an insult. He says it directly to her face. When he looks at the gold, he says, "I will not choose," right? Because you choose. He chooseth me, gain what many men desire, is what it says. And he says, "I will not choose what many men desire, because I will not jump with common spirits. I am not many men. I am not every man. I am not going to do what every man does. I do not jump with common spirits." And that's his response to the gold chest. But the silver one, his response. He says, "Let none presume to wear an undeserved dignity. Oh, that estate, degrees, and offices were not derived corruptly, and that clear honor were purchased by the merit of the wearer." Well spoken, right? Nobody should wear undeserved dignity. Nobody should wear borrowed clothes, right? One should. How terrible it is! He says that estates and degrees and offices are obtained so corruptly today in today's world, and that clear honor were purchased by the merit of the wearer. And while it sounds wonderful, there's no question that what's happening here is that there is a dig that's being given to not just Aragon, but the Spanish in general, is what he's suggesting. And so, it's one of those do as I say, not as I do thing. The suggestion, of course, that this is not probably how Aragon has gotten to his position in life. And yet, it's the one that he's going to take a shot at. And of course, he did not choose wisely. It is not the silver chest. And when he finds this out and he opens it up, what does he find inside the chest? But he says the face of a blinking idiot. He finds a picture of a fool, and that is him. He is very much portrayed as the fool. Generally, when acted out on stage, the character of Aragon is dressed like in all kinds of multicolored, which calls to mind the idea of the fool, the court jester. So he's generally dressed like that. And his lines are these: "Still more fool I shall appear by the time I linger here. With one fool's head I came to woo, but I go away with two. Sweet adieu. I'll keep my oath patiently to bear my wrath." wrath, anger, disappointment. So he's leaving not just with a fool in his hand, but himself being the fool as well, being played the fool. And he says he'll keep his oath, although he will be angry about it the rest of his life. And again, now the audience breathes a sigh of relief as the Spaniard does not win Portia. An Elizabethan audience would be very, very excited that the Spain have once again lost in an endeavor. So Aragon leaves, and what do we find right away as Aragon leaves? That a young Venetian has arrived at the gate to announce the arrival of his lord, come to woo Portia. And so there's another one who's very, very close behind just as soon as Aragon leaves. Right, we know who it is. They haven't given a name yet, but they know it's a young Venetian. And the end of Act Two isn't just finished with a couplet. It, in fact, is finished with a triplet that incorporates both Portia's lines with Nerissa's lines to give a triplet. So this has to be all the more important, all the more poignant a line. And the two of them rhyme together. And Portia starts it off. Come, come, Nerissa, for I long to see quick Cupid's post that comes so mannerly. Nerissa says, Bassanio, Lord love, if thy will it be. Fingers crossed. Let's hope it's Bassanio. And yes, in fact, it is Bassanio who is on his way. And so that closes out Act Two. Thank you for joining. We will continue next with an in-depth look at Act Three. We'll see you then.